Thank you, Seneshaw. So as Seneshaw said, there are three presentations in this session. The first is titled Enhancing Farmers' Resilience, as you see on the program, with Climate Information Services. It is by Professor Emilia Tjernstrom. I apologize for murdering your name. Senior Research Fellow at Monash University. Second presentation by Giulio, Implications for Social Protection Programs. And the third is by our own Seneshaw, Climate Change and Coffee in Ethiopia. So we have about an hour for this session. So each presentation would have 15 minutes. Each presenter will have 15 minutes, and we'll have a discussion for about 15 to 20 minutes. Emilia will start. I again apologize for really please go on.
No problem. You know, I'm used to it.
You are mute.
Oh, I tried.
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So as you might imagine, I'm quite used to having my last name pronounced in many different ways. So let me share my slides with you. Can everyone see those now? I'm going to assume yes, because I don't hear anyone.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm really excited to be here today, although I would have been much more excited to be in Addis with you all, but circumstances did not allow. But I'm very excited to be exploring today with you the relatively understudied area of climate information services. So I'll talk a little bit about what we know, but I'll talk more importantly about what we don't know, okay? This is an area where I think our collective understanding has substantial room to grow, and where increasing learning and increasing our understanding could literally empower millions of farmers and yield important insights for policy. So to set the stage, I want to just briefly examine some climate trends and forecasts for Ethiopia. Now, Stefan already did this, so I'll just dig into a few more pieces of information and as they relate to agriculture in particular, okay? As a country, we know Ethiopia is vulnerable to climate change, and agriculture is the economic sector by far that is the most vulnerable to these challenges. And this first figure shows how the yearly average air temperature has changed since the 1950s. And so from an average of around 22 degrees at the middle of the last century to just under 24 degrees. This is an increase of around 1/4 of a degree in 10 years. That's quite remarkable. This figure looks kind of similar, but it shows us the number of days with temperatures over 35 degrees, again, over the same time period, 1950 to 2020. So you can see that an event, number of days with temperature over 35 degrees, that used to happen 2 or 3 days per year is now happening closer to 4 or 5 days every year. And predictions are that these trends will continue under almost all climate change scenarios. You can see the different figures, the different lines here, different colors represent different predictions. The light purple line, so the bottom one, is sort of the most optimistic scenario, and it's really not very realistic. That is the scenario where the world reaches net zero emissions around 2050. I don't think many of us see that happening, unfortunately. The other lines all suggest that projected average temperatures are going to rise more quickly over the next decades and century. So what does this mean for agriculture, right? So what I'm here to talk about is enormously important for agriculture, right? These predicted temperature increases are massive, and more heat means that more moisture evaporates from the soil, right? Soil moisture is super important for farmers. It's important for crop health. It's important for agricultural productivity. And these changes are, of course, going to be most important for rain-fed agriculture, rain-fed smallholder agriculture, which describes the majority of Ethiopia's farmers, right? I'll very quickly touch upon rainfall. Stefano touched upon this already. One thing that will probably change, as he mentioned, we'll likely have more years at the extremes. So there'll be more years with extreme wet weather and more years with extreme dry weather. But we can already see that over the past 50 years, the number of consecutive dry days has increased on average, right? And of course, this should make you think of droughts, which is probably Ethiopia's agricultural sector's biggest threats. And while Stefano's right that on average, rainfall will probably increase somewhat. Again, different parts of the country will increase more than others. But on average, the increases in precipitation are not likely to be that large. Probably not enough in sort of a normal year to offset the much hotter weather and to offset the effects on productivity, okay? Again, extreme rainfall and loss of soil moisture has hugely important implications for agriculture, including for the livestock sector, right? So here's a big question that I want to explore in the rest of the talk. In a world where climate is going to be increasingly unpredictable, could timely and useful information forecasts about the climate make the difference for farmers between a thriving harvest and a failed crop? Could it make the difference between food-secure smallholders and hunger, the difference between sustainable growth in the agricultural sector and a stagnant economy that is hamstrung by climate change? Now, what are climate information services? Some people call them weather and climate services. We're going to call them climate information services. But the goals are really similar, right? The idea here is to provide farmers with timely and hopefully useful information about the upcoming season so that they can make better decisions, right? That's the ultimate hope. Better decisions, which will then result in higher yields and higher incomes, okay? So the literature is unfortunately rather sparse on this, okay? There's this map shows you the number of studies of climate information services on the continent, right? This is from 2019. They found a total of 66 studies that span the entire range of access, use, and/or impact of climate information services. And of these, really, the majority look at whether farmers have access to these services, not how these services might impact their productivity or their welfare, right? And this is a very important distinction. Another review article that looked at similar types of articles highlight that a big drawback in the literature as well is the lack of a comparison group, right? There's no counterfactual where they're comparing farmers who receive climate information to those who don't. And that makes it very difficult, of course, to assess the impact of using the information in decision-making. So I'm going to take a step back and think about what would we like to know? I've said there's gaps and we don't know very much, but in an ideal world, what are the things we really want to pin down? We want to look at the quality of existing weather and climate information. We want to know the type of weather and climate information that might be able to inform agricultural decision-making. And we want to see access. We want to look at access, whether farmers have access to these services, how this access varies by groups, by region, by gender. And we want to know whether the modality of information transmission, the design, and the implementation of climate information services, do they matter for the impact? Do they matter for how well farmers can make use of the information? And finally, we want to know the impact. How could climate information services, and how do they affect farmer incomes, productivity, and ultimately their welfare? I'm with Stefano on much more of a sustainable development type. So you'll hear me talk more about welfare than sort of productivity on its own. I find productivity on its own, if it's not increasing welfare's, less interesting. Now, in a very unscientific graph, I'd argue that the weight of evidence, the amount of evidence available, kind of decreases as we move down the line here. So how good are the existing services and pieces of information? There's more evidence on this, and there's sort of less and less information and evidence as we move down. Similarly, and maybe because of the difficulty of assessing these, right? Assessing the quality of the information is more straightforward than understanding or evaluating the impact of climate information services. So I'll talk briefly about each of these in turn. Quality is not something that, as a social scientist, that I'm particularly adept at evaluating, but these are the kinds of things we would like to look at here. Would be the quality of the forecasts, how accurate are they, how good are the predictions, what scale, what spatial scale are they able to predict at? That could be very useful in a country full of
Emilia, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you much. Yeah, I've got a little timer too, so thank you. The type of information is, there we want to look at the kinds of climate information that can inform agricultural decision making. So we want to think about the decisions that farmers have to take, what field to plant on, what crop variety, the timing of agricultural tasks, the application of inputs, etc. Right? So matching those decisions to the information that they can receive or that they can have access to. So seasonal rain forecasts, the onset of the rainy season, the likelihood of drought, etc. Soil moisture predictions are all really useful, potentially useful for farmers. Then we have the question of whether farmers have access to climate information services. And as Seneshaw and co-authors show, in 2018, only 18% of farm households in Ethiopia from the Feed the Future survey were able to access or had access to climate information services. That's very low. So we already know that that's certainly an area that would have to be worked on for climate information services to reach their potential. We want to know the dissemination channel, the form of the information, and how that affects who can access it and who can take advantage of it. So radio has been seen to be advantageous in a lot of contexts, but we also want to think about the kinds of barriers that might prevent climate information service use. Now, ultimately, I argue that we would care about how climate information services affect outcomes. None of the above matters if it doesn't increase yields, if it doesn't increase incomes, and if it doesn't improve welfare, right? Do farmers who have access to climate information services, are they better able to be resilient to climate change? Now, I've mostly told you that assessing the impact of climate information services is challenging and that there are gaps in the literature. There are many other reasons that it's hard. The impacts of climate information services might vary year to year, so we really need studies that take a longer view, because when the weather is normal, when everything happens the way it always has, the impact of having access to high quality climate information is not going to be very, very large, right? There are challenges around explaining really complex information with lots of uncertainty to low literacy populations, and building their trust in the information being accurate. And then finally, even if you are able to distribute high quality information at the right time to the right people in the right years, farmers might still face constraints that don't allow them to act upon the climate information services. These could be behavioral, this could be trust, it could be risk aversion, or it could be financial, that they don't have the money to purchase the drought-tolerant seeds that they would need to adapt and to respond to the information. But I would argue that the benefits are really massive, okay? As I've already mentioned, agriculture is the most vulnerable sector to climate change in Ethiopia and lots of other countries in the region. And if climate change can enhance farmers' resilience and adaptability and resilience to climatic variations, it could really be a transformative tool. And to my mind, it dovetails with a lot of the policy goals, a lot of the topics brought up in the IGC white paper. And another way to think about this is that the existing research gap presents a massive opportunity to learn. So in a sense, I think I'm kind of pitching not just that this is an important question, but that this is a place where research under IGC or related institutes could really feed into the broader policy goals by the Ethiopian government, and can enhance food security, reduce poverty, and lead to sustainable economic growth. But yeah, in general, I think one way to see these large gaps in our understanding and knowledge is to think of them as an opportunity to learn. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emilia, for an excellent presentation, as well as finishing exactly on time. That was perfect. And now
First time in my life.
I suggest that we leave the questions to the end, so that we will have perhaps more time if we need to. I'll invite Giulio to make his presentation now.
Okay, thank you to the IGC for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the themes we already touched upon in terms of social protection. So I'm Giulio Schinaia. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago. And I'm not sure I have this, which will help me to move through the slides. So climate change, as we have discussed already, is expected to increase the frequency and also the intensity of extreme weather events. And that's sort of the motivating reason why we've been, I think, talking today a lot about social protection. The fact that these extreme weather event shocks like floods and droughts are going to become more frequent and much harder. And this is going to have an implication for poverty reduction. So if the goal that we're trying to achieve is poverty reduction, climate change is going to sort of slow down our ability to achieve that goal. And in particular, climate change is expected to drive 35 to 122 million people into extreme poverty by 2030, adding to the already 700 million people that we currently estimate live under that threshold. Now, most of the poorest individuals in the world are smallholder farmers. And that's why here I'm focusing on sort of social protection programs in rural areas, because that's where incidence of poverty is highest. And those are the sort of people that will be most affected by climate change. So what I want to do for the rest of the talk is to talk about three social protection programs. We already touched upon at least two of them, and how those can support households in moving out of poverty, if that's the goal that we're trying to achieve, and to adapting to climate change shocks, coping with these shocks. So first, I'll talk again about graduation programs. Stefano already kind of touched upon most of the literature already. I'll give you a couple more details. Then I'll discuss weather responsive anticipatory cash transfers, so a way in which we can leverage new forecasting models and other advances in information technology to change the way social protection and cash transfers are delivered. And third, I'll discuss some evidence also from my own work on the PSMP and some outstanding questions that also Stefano alluded to earlier. So to talk about graduation programs and potentially the next generation of graduation programs, those programs that can become more focused towards climate resilience, we know that those are a very cost-effective way of moving out of poverty. And they are a multifaceted innovation that is made of multiple components. And as we said earlier, the sort of totality of those components is quite important to their cost effectiveness. They have persistent positive impacts on consumption, assets, and earnings documented in Bangladesh, in India. And this was a program, as we said earlier, that was pioneered by the NGO BRAC. So these are evaluations from the BRAC program in Bangladesh, but also the program that was implemented by the NGO Bandhan that had been trained by BRAC facilitators in India. And after 11 years, we see that those individuals in Bangladesh that had lower levels of assets, higher levels of assets rather, are those that are able to move out of extreme poverty 11 years after the transfer ended. So we see a sort of persistent way that these programs can cost effectively move people out of extreme poverty. Now, of course, you know, they're cost effective, they can give benefits that are 3 times their costs, but they're costly. And we already said that earlier in the Q&A, and their cost effectiveness can vary across settings. So recent evidence from the study in Ethiopia that we talked about earlier, this paper by Nathan Barker and co-authors, finds that after 7 years after the program ended, the control group in this experiment caught up a little bit with the treatment group. So the effects on consumption are still positive, but they're not as strong as they used to be 3 years after the intervention. And so after 7 years, this study finds that the benefits are equal to the costs. So not as promising as perhaps in other contexts like in India, but still potentially a worthwhile program to invest in. And so what we could potentially think about is maybe reduce the costs, but that, as we said, may actually lead to worse effectiveness. Another thing we could potentially think about is to add components that are more tailored towards adapting to climate change. And so there is ongoing research, but there is more potential to introduce components such as training on how to use climate resilient seeds and providing more of these types of seeds to farmers as an additional component to graduation programs, but also training on livestock management in a way that is tailored more towards adapting to climate shocks such as droughts. Another potential avenue is to build more financial services like insurance programs as part of these graduation programs in anticipation for climate shocks. Now, the second sort of social protection innovation that I wanted to mention is this idea of weather-responsive anticipatory cash transfers, which perhaps isn't very new to people that are familiar with the PSMP, but has been recently where we have recently seen more evidence and sort of is taking the philosophy of the PSMP one step forward. So it's really trying to act before the shock happens. So the idea of weather-responsive anticipatory cash transfer is the idea that households that are in contexts where climate shocks are anticipated, forecasted to hit at a very sort of tight precision, both in terms of timing, so a few days or a week before a shock hits, but also geographic precision, could benefit from receiving cash transfers before the shock actually takes place. So this can be done by leveraging advances in our ability to forecast the weather using remote sense data, but also using advances in mobile banking, such as mobile money, to, first of all, target who potential beneficiaries of these programs can be, but then to also deliver these transfers very, very soon before a shock hits. And we have growing evidence, but there is a lot of room to expand this body of work that suggests that those households that receive cash transfers ahead of a flood can boost can have higher food security and increase the resilience to shocks in a cost-effective way relative to ex-post or humanitarian assistance, which sometimes is quite delayed relative to when the shock hits. So we have two pieces of evidence so far that I wanted to mention. One is an experiment in northern Nigeria conducted by IFPRI that evaluated a program that provided cash transfers ahead of a flood run by International Rescue Committee, which finds that those households that received the transfers were less likely to resort to coping strategies that potentially are negative in the long run. Another piece of evidence is a non-experimental evaluation of a World Food Program that found that households that were provided cash transfers before a flood hit were 36% less likely to go get a day without eating. Now, I want to sort of put a little caveat on this second study, and there is more evidence growing from this team because this was not an experiment, and perhaps you may have quibbles as to what the control group, whether it's the right counterfactual. And then the sort of third program that I'll tell you more about is the Productive Safety Net program here in Ethiopia. It needs no introduction in this room because it's one of the largest social protection programs in Africa. In the round that ended in 2019, in that phase, it reached almost 8 million beneficiaries and had a very large budget. Now, as we know, the main components, not the only components of the program, are the public works component and the direct support program. And those are targeting I'll be focusing on the rural side of things, rural households that have experienced food insecurity in the past. Now, there has been a lot of work evaluating the rural PSMP, and most of this work has focused on PSMP Woredas that were targeted and has used non-experimental evaluations, although there is growing work in this space by people in this room to continue evaluating the effectiveness of the program. But there hasn't been a lot of work happen to sort of understand the general equilibrium effects of a program like the PSMP. There is a little bit of work. So I think Dr. Alemayehu and others have worked on a computable general equilibrium model to estimate the sort of welfare effects of the PSMP on the local economy. And then some work by Gazo and Stefan to look at the yield effects at the sort of Woreda level. But we don't know, for example, what's the effect of the PSMP program on rural labor markets as much. So some of my own work has tried to understand the effects of the program, relying on the spatial distribution of the program and the targeting rule that was applied at the beginning of the program. So in this map, you can sort of see, I know the screens don't do it justice, but in those Woredas that have got some dots on them, those are the PSMP Woredas that were targeted in phase 2, sort of up until 2009. And then in the colors, the sort of red and orange and yellow are the number of years of emergency assistance that was provided to those Woredas before the PSMP started. And that's a key targeting criteria that was used at the beginning of the program to identify which were going to be the initial Woredas to be part of the program. Now, once we control for that, we can sort of start trying to do a difference in difference comparison of those Woredas, the labor markets in those Woredas before the program started, controlling for the targeting variable, and then look at those comparison after the PSMP with those non-PSMP Woredas. So in my own work, I find that looking at labor market outcomes using the Labor Force Survey, there is no effect on whether the PSMP Woredas have a higher share of people in the labor force or whether they are working more hours. But I do see that people in PSMP Woredas report to being more outside of self-employment in agriculture. So I see specifically a 5% increase in the number of workers, especially women, that are self-employed but are outside of agriculture. And I have some sort of
Giulio.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Thank you. And so some evidence that ongoing analysis suggests that this is not necessarily coming from PSMP Kebeles, but it's actually more of an effect that is driven by those Kebeles that are within a PSMP Woreda that are benefiting from potentially the increased demand for goods out of the PSMP Kebeles. And I don't find effects on wages. But that's partly sort of my ongoing agenda, is to try and unpack the sort of lack of effects on wages using more recent data, such as the labor force survey in 2021. This was analysis that was relying on the first 3 rounds of the labor force survey. So just to finalize my presentation with some potential next questions, is the sort of questions that Stefano had alluded to in his presentation, and potentially how to go about them. So with this new round of the 2021 labor force survey, we can start asking more about how does the PSMP change migration, not just the evidence from the World Bank report, but also using this study, and also trying to understand how this potential change in migration interacts with climate shocks, and whether previous occurrence of climate shocks can have differential impacts of the PSMP on labor markets or on migration in and out of PSMP or others. And, you know, one of the sort of important steps to try and answer this question is to get more granular data on the implementation of the program. And so that's something that I'm currently working on, to understand better the number of beneficiaries at the WREDA level over time, and how that changes, and also the fact that there are more components, such as the shock responsive component of the program, which clearly have an impact on these type of decisions that households make. So happy to discuss and to keep the discussion going, but that's all I wanted to tell you for now. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Giulio. You can sit here. Next presenter is Seneshaw, and he has 15 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. It's always difficult to be the last presenter before lunch. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Slide, please. Yeah, this is a quick study that we did on climate change and coffee in Ethiopia. This has been touched upon the previous presenters. This shows global temperature changes over the last century or so by country. So the major takeaway is global temperature is rising. According to the latest IPCC report, more than 3 billion people would be highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So I don't want to bore you in going in detail. Why coffee? Coffee is considered one of the most climate-sensitive crops. It is, by its nature, fragile to changes in climate variables, especially temperatures. So slight changes in temperature would affect the production, productivity, tastes, and aroma, and also would change the production belts of coffee. So some areas would be suitable, some areas would become unsuitable. Why coffee? As you all know, coffee is the most important single export item from Ethiopia. Last year alone, it accounted for more than 35% of merchandise exports. More than 4 million people, more than 4 million farming households directly rely on coffee for their livelihood. For example, if you assume 5 household members per household, that would mean close to 20 million people directly relying on coffee for their livelihood. So this is the most important, one of the most important sectors in Ethiopia. This is the graph of coffee value and volume. You can see that the value has substantially increased over time, even though this increment in value came from changes in global prices, and the quantity exported are more or less remained flat over time. Changes in climate variables would affect coffee via 2 mechanisms. One is changes in temperature would mean spread of diseases and pests, and this affects production and productivity of coffee. And the second one is changes in temperature would make some areas suitable and some areas unsuitable for coffee production. This graph that I borrowed from IFPRI 2015 survey shows that some of the farmers might have already facing the impact of climate change. This graph shows the vertical axis is percentage of farmers. And we asked them for each good year, how they face production irregularities. And close to 40% said for each good year, they face one bad year. So this is huge result. And close to 40% also stated for each good harvest year, they would also face two bad years. In total, close to 80% of the farmers face some sort of production irregularity particularly due to changes in climate variables. This figure also that I borrowed from the same survey shows the kind of extent of diseases, coffee diseases. And as you can see, these bar graphs compares the scenario between 2005 and 2015, the blue bars 2015. The majority of the farmers consider coffee diseases as the most prevalent issues. For example, 36% of the farmers stated that coffee diseases have become one of the biggest problems. This graph, that map, I'm not sure if the contrast does justice to the different colors, but this shows the changes in suitability of coffee production. The different colors show the suitable and unsuitability. The greener ones show more suitable areas or no considerable changes in suitability of coffee production. The red ones show less suitability. I am more interested in the purple graph. I'm not sure if you can see. I'm not sure if I know how to point. Anyways, the purple graphs, which are located in the upper highlands, in the northern parts, show newer areas coming into coffee growing suitability range. So there are new areas becoming more suitable for coffee. This has a number of implications, particularly for the new entrants. They need to have the skill sets and the production capabilities to engage in coffee cultivation. And there are also potential exiters from coffee cultivation. There are suggested mitigation and adaptation mechanisms, short-term and long-term mechanisms, medium to long-term shade trees development and dissemination of improved coffee varieties, and migration. By migration, I mean moving into the newer areas. Short-term solutions are considered to be mulching, pruning, and value addition. I will particularly focus on the value addition part for the short term. This graph shows the different production activities that farmers already undertaking. There are stamping trees are not considered. They are not practiced by the farmers. Majority of the farmers do not necessarily practice these potentially different adaptation and mitigation mechanisms in general. And given the potential spread of coffee diseases, it is interesting to see less pesticides and fungicides adopted by the farmers, literally close to zero. So there are less and less adaptation mechanisms. Moving into the value addition part of my study, looking at the upper right corner, we can see one area of value addition and as a form of adaptation mechanism is to move into voluntary sustainable standards in the form of organic coffee. The upper right figure shows the red solid line and blue line compare the price premium at international market for organic and non-organic coffee. You can see, given that the red solid line is to the right of the blue one, organic coffee fetches more than 26 higher premium at international markets. So one would think that the country should move into this area, this untapped resource. But interestingly, the left bottom right shows the share of organic and inorganic coffee exported over the last 2 decades. And interestingly, looking at the red lines, you can see that the share of organic coffee is literally we claim that we are exporting organic coffee, but the share of organic coffee is only close to 4% of total exports. The other value addition is washing coffee. You can see as well from the upper right figure that washed coffee fetches up to 30% higher premium at international market. But interestingly, looking at the bottom left figure, the share of washed coffee is only close to 30% overall. So the country is also missing out on this potential. And the other interesting point is also the share of specialty coffee. Specialty coffees are the so-called grade 1 and grade 2 coffees. And I understand that the government is striving very hard to raise the share of washed coffee and also specialty coffee. The specialty coffees fetch more than 40% premium at international market. But interestingly, once again, looking at the other figure, bottom left figure, the share of specialty coffees is not as big as we would like to see. Even though the share of grade 1 is increasing, the share of the other specialty coffee, grade 2, is declining. So this could also be one area to tap into. This last slide, I'm not sure if it can be considered as value addition, looks at different destinations of coffee. The solid lines indicate gains in share over the last 10 or so years. And coffee exporters are, for one reason or another, they are moving more into Middle East and Australia, Japan, China, and other areas. And they are moving away from the conventionally or the traditionally big importers of our coffee, such as USA and Europe. So this could also be one point to look at in the short term to kind of mitigate the potential impact of climate change. So in conclusion, we have seen that coffee is one of the most climate sensitive crops. We have to understand the different barriers to adaptation at the farmer level. Given the longer gestation period, given that coffee is a perennial crop, further research and stakeholder engagement on adaptation and mitigation mechanism is also key. We are conducting with a researcher from Policy Studies Institute, where Dr. Mukonnin. We are also doing further studies on coffee. I hope I didn't take too much time. I will leave you with this hot coffee.
Thank you very much, Seneshaw. Please join us. So you finished on time again. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for a questions and answer session. The floor is open. Dr. Moti, one. Yes, hi. And so 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's start with these 3, and then let's see if we have a chance to have a second round.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the 3 presenters, but my questions are to the first and the last, Professor Emilia and Dr. Seneshaw. To Professor Emilia, it's good that you acknowledge the difficulties in assessing the impact of climate information services. That's very nice because we can observe that farmers might have access, but utilization is a difficult aspect to see because utilization is subject to different things, including access to technologies to respond to the information that they receive, and also institutions through which these technologies would be available to farmers. So are there any studies that you have come across that considered the diversity in farmers having access to these technologies and institutions that might also affect the utilization to see the impact of climate information services? or maybe looking into this dimension might also complicate in looking at the impact studies. Dr. Seneshaw, just out of curiosity, where you showed us, the how many or what proportion of farmers have responded, how many bad years that they have for every one good year. One bad year for every one good year is a lot of shock to see from the coffee production side. Is it something related to the physiology of coffee, or are we considering this totally to climate effects? Thank you very much. If this, because of the physiology of coffee, there's nothing that farmers could do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Dait from the Environment and Climate Research Center. Maybe my question forward to the Emily. You mentioned about the climate information system, but climate information system may require a very ample system of data and knowledge repository system. So how we can link this repository system, because farmers may have access with different simplified methods of information accessing, but we need to have also this repository system, a very multidisciplinary nature. So how can we link with this issue with knowledge and data system? The other thing is you mentioned some of the policy goals that can be linked with this CIS. But the country is following the resilience and green development pathways. So how the policy goals that are stated in the NDC, which is related to the adaptation and mitigation effort, so resilience and climate change issues, how can we link it with that? Because the shocks because of the climate change may be in advance overcome by having a very good information. That will also lead us to the damage and recovery mechanisms when we have some climate change impact in our system. That will give us some information to plan for a recovery mechanism from those shocks and impacts. So how can you relate I didn't see on your policy goals the contribution or the link with adaptation and mitigation effort of the country. Thank you very much. And sorry for Sene, I think Dr. Moti also highlighted the issue. The coffee is very climate sensitive product as compared to other products in the agriculture. So how we are very sure to link the sensitivity of the coffee in relation to the climate shocks? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, the three presenters, for the interesting presentation. Yeah, my first question is related to the first presentation by Professor Emilia regarding the climate information services. And my question is, I mean, always I have like a concern regarding the climate adaptation, climate change adaptation by rural farm households, particularly in Ethiopia, where climate change and culture or religion is intertwined or interconnected, where most of the people believe that climate change is caused by God or some external factor. So I was asking myself, like, yeah, we had also a couple of evidences showing that about 50 to 60% of rural households, even in Kenya, say that the cause of climate change is God, not really related with environmental degradation or pollution or deforestation. So in the presence of this kind of cultures or religion, do you think that people will have like trust on this kind of climate information services? That's my question related. I mean, regarding the presentation regarding to the climate information service. And another question is related to the second presentation, where one of the components of the PSNP is like labor for work, where poor households are invest a lot of labor, like in tree planting, soil conservation, and so forth. Do we have evidence showing that? Of course, there are some evidence showing that PSNP participation increases, like livestock holding, tree planting, including the JDB paper by Professor Alemayehu. Do we have like rigorous findings showing that, especially using like maybe satellite data, showing that participating in this kind of, or having this kind of social protection programs really contributes to the climate change adaptation strategy? So yeah, these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I abuse my position as chair and ask a question to Giulio, but okay, I'll come to you guys in a bit. And that is, the PSNP has a P in front of it, and that is productivity or productive. Can you say something about how that productive element could be further enhanced and go beyond the beneficiaries and benefit the community as a whole? But before I come to you guys, let me have, okay. So, please make your questions brief, because.
Okay, thank you so much. This is Adunya from Coffee and Tea Authority. I'm Director General. I really appreciate the presentations made by all the three presenters. But to be very specific, I wanted to address the question to Dr. Seneshaw. As you've clearly indicated that the organic certification and the washed coffee, specialty coffee, I don't know how you classify them as a value addition, one. Second, you clearly indicated that the largest proportion of our coffee is going to the Middle East rather than the US and also Japan. Is that mainly because the Japan, US, and Germany and EU, they are actually buying very specialty coffee, whereas the Middle East, they are buying the commercial type of coffee. So how do you relate this in with the changing climatic conditions? Thank you so much.
Mine? Thank you. Thank you. I have one question to Dr. Seneshaw regarding the impact of climate change on coffee in Ethiopia. We know that coffee is a perennial crop. That means the climate variability or climate variability that may be a shock either in the rainfall or the temperature at the seedling or growing or the fruit germination, generation type may significantly affect the coffee yield. So how can you differentiate the effect of the series of climate variability elements? That means that the one that affect the seedling time or the growing time or the seed formation and harvesting time that significantly affect the coffee productivity. At the same time, one more issue: how much is the reduction in the quantity, and how much is the reduction in the quality, which finally result into having a loss in the price at international market? This is our issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My question goes for the last presenter. As the conclusion part, the impact of the climatic change on coffee production is indicated, and it is found to be significant. So which type of statistical tools that you consider to come up with this kind of conclusion? The second of my question is, for example, of the climatic change, you discussed about the temperature and the rainfall. Have you seen the magnitude of each predictor variables on the response variable, which we call that coffee production? If so, which of the two variables is so predominant in influencing the coffee production? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'll give each presenter 3 minutes to respond to these questions, starting from, in the order of the presentation, starting from Emilia.
Well, this is quite the challenge then. These are really great questions, and I think I need 30 minutes for each of them, but then I really wish I were there and could say, you know, let's chat about this over lunch. But very quickly then, there are not, on the question of sort of, are there studies that focus on different types of farmers and the impacts and how institutions interact with the climate information services? There really are not very many, certainly not that look at impacts on productivity and welfare, because there's very few. Now, if we get Seneshaw and Dr. Mekonnen and I and my co-author Wang here from Monash, we've applied for some funding. So if we get that funding, then we would hope to generate evidence on precisely these questions. So fingers crossed. Related to the complexity and sort of the requirements of generating climate information services, there's the Ethiopian National Meteorological Agency actually already has quite a lot of high quality information and produces forecasts for both sort of the next 10-day period, monthly, and seasonal forecasts. So I think a lot of the effort, a lot of the hurdles are really translating that and to farmers in a way that they can understand and a way that they can act upon, I think is potentially the bigger challenge than actually having access, generating that information. Now, in terms of connecting to larger policy goals, I agree, climate information services could certainly connect with resilience and climate change issues as well. I sort of focused on the ones that were less obvious, perhaps. And in terms of how it can connect with damage and recovery mechanisms, I think the data needs for providing, for example, insurance, integrating insurance into social protection systems, that kind of question, climate. I'm working on a project in Fiji, actually, that is specifically looking at integrating climatic disaster insurance into the country's social protection system. And so I think that is one way to connect or to link this with damage and recovery mechanisms. Now, the final question on what happens when people believe that climate change is due to, you know, God or other forces. I think, in a sense, that is, to my mind, it's less of a problem in terms of building people's trust in information that could change their behavior. It's more of an issue if we wanted to convince farmers that they have to change their behavior to reduce the effects of climate change. But in many ways, rural Ethiopians are contributing extremely little to climate change today, right? They're not the ones flying, they're not the ones burning fossil fuels. So in a sense, from their perspective, they have very little to do with the forces that generate climate change. And so I think there's still scope for explaining to folks that, look, here's, regardless of what the cause is, here are sort of our beliefs, our best available information about what your agricultural season will look like. And I think it has less to do with their beliefs and perceptions about the broader and longer term climate change and whether, who caused it, whether it's human-made or, something that comes from outside of our control. But thank you all both for listening and for the great questions, and I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Emilia. Thank you very much. Giulio?
Thank you for the great questions. So to the first question on the sort of impacts of the PSMP on climate resilience, I feel like one of the papers I mentioned was this paper on the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, published in 2022 by Jules Gazot and Victor Stéphane. They use remotely sensed data to measure yields. So if you want to take yields as a measure of climate resilience, they didn't find, using their their methodology, effects on yields. So they find a null effect, and that's a sort of perhaps not a very optimistic finding, but I feel like there is still room to build more evidence, and perhaps linking more of the public works projects data with other measures of climate resilience. I feel like there is potentially avenues there to have a more nuanced understanding, because their measure of yields was still at the Woreda level, and there may be microclimates even within Woredas where you could measure heterogeneity within that null effect. And then to the question of how to make potentially the practice safety net program more productive, it's a great question. And I feel like some of the programs that we have talked about today, like from digital agricultural services, but also the livelihoods component of the program, and the fact that it links to not only focuses on poverty reduction, but aims to change the portfolio of economic activities that rural households engage with. And I believe the new phase, the current phase of the program, is also strengthening the wage pathway of the program. So investing in those types of components, and even having the climate resilient graduation components potentially be part of the livelihoods component of the program, could be interesting ways to adapt the program to climate change to make it more productive. So less than 3 minutes, I hope.
Thank you very much for the very nice questions. To begin from Dr. Motis and also Dr. David's question, whether the bad years for the prevalence of the different bad years for every good year, whether it is physiological or not. We tried to look this by region, and we did, and what we found is this prevalence are more common, more skewed toward this western part of the country, where the bulk of coffee is produced, in Welaga, in Jimma, and what have you. From that particular area, and I know for every good year, we kind of get one bad year. But in the southern part, particularly in the Gachafe and Sidama, the coffees are more protected, mulching is more common, pruning is more common, and yeah, so it has got to do with different adaptation mechanisms. So it's not necessarily physiological phenomenon. Dr. Adunya's question, whether organic coffee is value addition. What I meant is in terms of the premium that it gets at international markets. Generally, organic coffees, not only organic, voluntary sustainable standards get significantly higher premium at international market. So that's what I meant by value addition. The second one, in terms of, I think you raised destinations, why more toward the Middle East. We have a hunch that is that this has got to do with the issue with other Arabica coffee producing areas such as Brazil and Colombia, and Middle East is slightly shifting towards Ethiopia. And there is also an ongoing study that we are currently doing. We are looking at different policies and their potential impacts, and we suspect that those policies also have some impact on why there are changes in destinations. The last two questions, how do we differentiate whether it is due to climate issues or other potentially yield affecting or productivity affecting variables? This is just a snapshot of the result. This is a preliminary finding. We are doing a more rigorous quantitative analysis. So we will share those different methodologies and quantitative analysis when we finalize. I think those are questions directed to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before we close, I just would like to point out two things. The first is because I have been associated with the Productive Safety Net Program, I would like to highlight three results that link that program to the resilience. The first is its impact on forest cover. There is some evidence indicating that products have a higher forest cover. Then the second is to complement Giulio's observation about yield impact of the PSNP. There is also some evidence at the household level, but in the communities at the Kabale level to indicate that productivity impact is observed using a panel data dynamic framework. The third is PSNF's impact on resilience, defined here as the speed with which people subject to shock recover their pre-shock level of welfare. And it has been identified PSNP payments or transfers have helped beneficiaries to recover from shocks faster than non-beneficiaries. Again, recovery to their original position rather than better position. So these evidence exist about PSNP and resilience broadly defined. Another point I'd like to include here is the fact that the outcomes of climate change are uncertain. And Stefano has shown us the band within which the rather wide band within which these outcomes vary. Now, these may suggest to some people that we have time or we have room. Rather, what we have to perhaps think in terms of, and perhaps we should emphasize, is the precautionary principle. This is a systemic impact, and therefore we are playing with, in effect, collapse. So the precautionary principle suggests that we have to act even if we are uncertain about the actual outcome, because if the outcome happens, we have no time to act. So we have to emphasize this dimension regularly. I'd like to ask you to join me to thanking the presenters for this session. We learned a lot. Thank you very much, presenters. And I will hand over now to the organizers.
Thank you very much. I change hat and I have a quick announcement. I believe that we had a wonderful session, especially the third presentation. We will have lunch. Somebody should guide us. It should be around, down the hall, I was told. So we should reconvene at 2 p.m., exactly 2 p.m. Yes.